Hey guys, I hope you are all having a fantastic week. So this week our chapter is on the response to intervention model, also known as RTI. That's the acronym we use for that, as well as the referral and placement process into special education. So we're going to take a few minutes and talk mainly about RTI today for you. So one thing I want to point out is that a lot of times when you think about students with disabilities, we think about kids with more obvious disabilities. So kids who might have a physical impairment that is very visible, kids with Down syndrome, who obviously have facial features and other aspects of their physical appearance that make it evident they have a disability. When we're talking about RTI, this is more for kids who are not identified before they get into school. So any student who has a mild disability initially is most likely going to be identified as having that disability after they reach school age, and typically this is done by the classroom teacher. So as a classroom teacher, you may be the first person to notice that this student may have a disability. So kind of the purpose of the RTI process is to ensure that when a student is not being successful within the classroom, it's not a result of ineffective teaching or practices being put into play in that classroom. So basically, the law says that a student must receive research-based and evidence-based practices prior to being referred to special education. So the process basically looks to ensure that all students are receiving high quality instruction. So within RTI, there is a framework or a model that implements different steps or tiers of interventions that are put into place. So I want you to think of RTI as not one specific one size fits all program necessarily, but it's more of a guideline and a framework, and different schools and across different states will implement the framework differently. So some areas will have 3 tiers, where other places will have 4 tiers. Interventions that are put into place within tier 1 of RTI may differ in one school from another school, just depending on what the unique needs of those students are within those schools. So keep in mind, it's a framework. It's not a cookie cutter program that is implemented with students. So within RTI, traditionally we see 3 tiers. So we're going to talk about the 3 different tiers and kind of what each of those tiers looks like and involves. So tier 1 of RTI, this applies to all students. So all students within a school receive tier 1 services within the RTI framework. So what does that mean? Essentially, this means that all the instructional activities that are taking place within the classroom focus on the state curriculum and the performance standards that are being implemented. That instruction is differentiated for the learners within the classroom. So if I were to ask each of you, how do you learn best? Some of you might say, oh, well, I learn best visually. Some might say, I learn best when I'm doing things with my hands. Or others might say, no, I learn best through my auditory senses, right? So we know that students learn differently, right? So differentiating our instruction simply means looking at different ways to get our instruction to students based on their individual needs. So, as a great teacher, you are not implementing your instructional strategies only in one way, right? You're doing it in different ways so that all of your students can benefit from the instruction you're providing. Um, Under Tier 1, we also, there's a big focus on progress monitoring, okay? So you give your students an assessment. Obviously, you want to compare how they're doing now to how they were doing when you started. So the continual monitoring of their progress through these standards is a key factor in determining whether a student is successful under Tier 1 practices of RTI. In addition, positive behavior supports are put into play. We'll talk more about positive behavior supports throughout the class, but basically this is best practices for teaching students appropriate behavior, rewarding them for when they exhibit appropriate behavior, and making that more of a rhythm within your classrooms. So if you take a look at page 61 in your textbook, under Tier 1, they go a little bit more in depth about what it means to be an effective teacher within the Tier 1 um, tier of the framework of RTI. So I encourage you to read that. As classroom teachers, it is your full responsibility to make sure that your instruction is effective for all the students within your classroom under Tier 1 so that you're being the best teacher that you can be and making sure that you're implementing your instruction effectively. Of great importance within that is that not only are you implementing great instruction, but you as a teacher know how to progress monitor your students' progress and you know how to analyze your data. So when students are not successful under Tier 1, okay, we say they are considered at risk. And those students will be moved to Tier 2 of RTI. So Tier 2 focuses on a standard intervention protocols approach. And essentially what that means is that interventions are predetermined by a team of people. So within the school that you work at, there's a team of people who've decided what the Tier 2 interventions are that they're going to try with students who are considered at risk. Now, once students receive more targeted interventions within Tier 2, some students make significant progress, and then those students no longer need those interventions. So just because a student goes to Tier 2 and is considered at risk, it doesn't mean that student will stay there. Okay? So if you're moved to Tier 2, let's say for struggling with reading, a targeted intervention is put into place. You make adequate gains to where you're on target with your grade level. That intervention is now removed and you're now considered successful under Tier 1. Okay? Now, some students will make progress, but it won't be sufficient. Okay? These students would continue on with Tier 2. The intervention that they're currently using may be tweaked a little bit to be more effective for them, or another intervention may be put into place. Now, if no progress is made, those are the students who are going to be referred to Tier 3 of the RTI process. So within Tier 3, it's important to remember that all the procedures that were happening in Tier 1, so all the things that are going on within the student's general classroom, are still in place, as well as the targeted interventions from Tier 2. Okay? So now if I am at Tier 3 of the RTI process, I'm receiving services from Tier 1, Tier 2, and now Tier 3. Now at Tier 3, the student support team comes into play. Okay? Student support team is probably a term you've heard if you've been in schools. Often this is abbreviated as SST. Okay? There are other names for this team, but predominantly within the state of Georgia you hear SST. So the goal of the SST team is to look for what are the possible solutions that we can put into play for this student to help them to be successful in Gen Ed. So what are the instructional practices that we can implement that will help the student learn? So the student support team is a valuable team. It really essentially is the last step before a student is referred to special education. However, all students who are at Tier 3 of RTI do not go on to special education. So that's an important differentiation. Sometimes students will be successful at Tier 3 and then they will not be referred on. So just because a student has a student support team doesn't mean that they are going to end up being referred for special education. Now, students who are unsuccessful at Tier 3, so the SST team has put other interventions into play, still the student is not being successful, then those students would be referred for an evaluation. So the evaluation now goes into play in determining whether or not this student has a disability and what needs to be done to best serve that student within the schools. As a classroom teacher, if you have a student within your classroom who ends up with a student support team and then they are referred to special education, it's your job to provide thorough documentation of all the interventions that that student has had and what their progress has been towards those. So it's not sufficient to simply say that the student is failing your math class. When you are providing that documentation, you need to be really specific as to what things have been tried with that student and what the student's success was like or failure within those interventions. So I want to take a minute and just kind of show you this example. This is an RTI model that I actually just pulled off the internet, and this is specific to a school, and it's a school that's in Michigan. If you read closely, you can see some things about the school on here. So I want to just show you how schools take a framework and they apply it. So for this school, if you look here, so we have our Tier 1 universal for all students, things that they're focusing on, high quality program of instruction, right? And they're using a specific reading curriculum. They have 90 minutes of direct instruction every day. Universal screening is done for all students 3 times per year. So these are things that are done for all students, okay? Then they have more specific things within Tier 2 for their targeted interventions. So they've noted that they're focusing on a group of non-responders from Tier 1. They're adding an additional time of instruction, additional progress monitoring. So at Tier 1, we were monitoring 3 times a year with the universal screening, okay? Now we're progress monitoring bi-weekly to ensure adequate progress in learning. I think this model also just does a good job of showing that as we go up, there's an increase in intensity of what's offered. And then after Tier 3, the final step will be special education referral if those students are not successful. So again, this triangle is simply a model. There are lots of different models out there. They can look very different based on school to school. I do want you to take a look at the triangle that is in your textbook. It's figure 3.1 on page 62, and it's a more of just a basic model of the triangle that kind of talks about the specifics to the tiers based on a more broad approach. So that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions about the RTI process.